Journalist, author, and leftist Twitter personality Talia Lavin joined Briahna Joy Gray's Bad Faith podcast this week in a conversation that went awry when the topic turned to de-radicalization and coalition building with the far right. Here's some video of that.
Listen, I don't think that I'm going to be able to convince you. I think if you want to hold hands with a Nazi and kiss them gently on the cheek, that's fine. I just don't think that's going to work out well for you.
Do you think that what I'm arguing for is that I Briahna Joy Gray, who was sitting before you as a Black woman, wants to hold hands with Nazis and kiss them in the street? I'm not trying to debate you at all here. I'm trying to explore what I think are some tensions that I too am wrestling with. And I would hope that since we're both members of this group, of these groups, that certainly see no benefit in appeasing Nazis, that we can have a conversation that doesn't presume that where we're coming from is because of some natural sympathy with these groups, as opposed to genuinely trying to strategize about how to fix this problem that we very much agree on, which is that America is being increasingly radicalized in these extremist ways.
I feel like I've stated my position repeatedly, and then I don't quite know how to react to respond other than no, I really believe what I believe. Everything we can do to mitigate those feelings in such large masses of the population, that's great. I think there are many constructive things you can do to fight Nazism that don't involve brass knuckling up and just flattening the nose of a Proud Boy. But I think you have to be willing to brass knuckle up and flatten the nose of a Proud Boy too.
Well, after the podcast was posted, Talia took to Twitter and posted private DMs between her and Briahna, captioning it, quote, "an absolute mess." Glenn Greenwald joined the fray, tweeting out, "Amazing. Lavin feels comfortable accusing Gray of wanting to kiss Nazis, literally, due to Brie's crime of believing in the best left-wing tradition that root causes should be understood instead of just calling people bad names." Well, we've invited Lavin to join Rising at a future time to discuss, but right now we have the host of Bad Faith podcast and former national spokesperson for the Bernie Sanders campaign, Briahna Joy Gray, here to give her side of the story. Briahna, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So how do you feel about being called a Nazi and all these other things? I mean, what is your take on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately very unfortunate. I'm obviously very humbled and grateful that so many interesting guests are willing to come on Bad Faith podcast and engage in good faith conversation with me there. I was really interested in talking to Talia because few people have had as much close proximity with people that are so radicalized and far right and extremist as she has. Her book and her project has been to infiltrate right-wing spaces online, including by making a dating profile on white.net and interacting with men on there for a year and a half. So my first question to her, it actually wasn't about deprogramming at all. I simply asked her as a leftist what that experience did to inform her confidence or pessimism about building broad coalitions, not with Nazis, of course, but how did it broadly inform her thoughts and feelings about how to coalition build among a broad multiracial coalition? And she immediately pivoted the conversation to deprogramming, presumably because she's gotten a lot of questions about that before. And it became very defensive almost immediately. And I was curious about that, primarily because so often these conversations go off the rails because one party or the other accuses each other of anti-Semitism, of being a Nazi sympathizer, exactly the way it happened here. And I hoped that because I'm a Black American who obviously benefits not at all from the rise of Nazis, and that I argued is equally yoked insofar as my community and hers have a lot to lose from the rise of radical extremism, that we might be able to have a reasonable conversation that didn't default into this kind of identity essentialism. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think her behavior, she ended up making the worst possible case you could for the argument she was making. And we're not talking behind her back. She's welcome, and I hope she does come here and discuss this with us. But she is essentially in the camp saying that it is fine to deny certain rights, free speech protections to the far right, to the extreme right, people engaged in far right activity. And I always say, well, if you're going to have that standard, backtrack from the old ACLU standard that the Nazis should be able to march through Skokie, then you have to have a very clear definition of who actually is a Nazi and which rights we're taking away. At the very, I wouldn't support this, but this would be a way you'd have to go about doing it. And instead, she's expanding the definition of who is a Nazi to include you, and saying the rights that should be taken away include they should be met with explicit violence. So I feel like she is undermining any plausible case you could make for she's not strongmanning the Antifa position, is she?
Yeah, the Skokie example is important because the argument that ACLU is making there is not that Nazis are good and should be defended or that there is any value necessarily to their speech, but part of the principle is that it is so difficult to discern whose speech should and should not be abridged, right? Whose rights should and shouldn't be taken away, and who's going to be the arbiter of that. And it's particularly concerning that Talia showed a lack of humility in that regard because, and I don't bring this up because I have any interest in, digging in on this point or highlighting a mistake. A lot of people make mistakes, but she is kind of known for having been let go from the New Yorker as a fact checker because she misidentified an ICE officer as having a white supremacist tattoo that in fact was not a white supremacist tattoo, ending up targeting that person for what ultimately ended up being unjustified hate and attack, right? So if you have already made a mistake like that in your personal life as a fact checker at a prestigious institution, one might think you would have a little humility before going around saying that folks need to be deplatformed, et cetera. And in fact, in the context of our conversation, she admitted that deplatforming would ultimately disproportionately affect the left. She completely conceded that point. It will hurt the left more than the right. And yet she decided that that was okay and a fine consequence, I guess, if it met the ultimate ends. And as someone who is only able to support herself, frankly, after having been marginalized by the mainstream news media for having progressive values, by having an independent platform and a site like Patreon, I think it's really concerning to see her willingness to take such draconian action without even giving some thought into what the kind of metrics would be for that kind of attack on free speech.
Yeah.
What I found most disturbing or interesting about this entire episode was that there seems to be a large portion of people online who subscribe to the idea that this entire conversation actually should not have taken place, and that is not just a legitimate but almost a dominant perspective, that there was something inherently wrong with even discussing this. Oftentimes, Briahna, I think when you get into kind of Twitter kerfuffles, you know what you're getting into. Sure. But this one, I'm curious if you did or not, or if you were kind of blindsided by the reaction to it.
Yeah, it is interesting. I reached out to Talia because I hadn't actually read her book when I reached out. I did, obviously, before our interview. But what attracted me to her was that she demonstrates a willingness to kind of live her life out loud and be vulnerable publicly online, which I honestly have a lot of empathy for. And I think it takes a lot of courage because I know firsthand how aggressive and unpleasant it can be to be a human being on the internet. And I thought that because of the vulnerability that she displayed online, she might be willing to get into some of these trickier conversations and might trust me because I'm a Black woman, because we've worked in similar spaces on the internet, to kind of open the door to some questions which I genuinely am wrestling with and find genuinely difficult. I did not expect her to walk out of the interview. That's never happened to me before. It certainly wasn't a contentious conversation on my end. It was very mellow. I think people who go and on Patreon and subscribe and listen to the whole thing will find themselves kind of surprised by the difference between the energy on the internet and the energy in the interview. And then there's another level of conversation where a lot of people seem to think that I should not have aired the interview at all because she walked off of it, which is not, I don't know how interviews work, I'm afraid, especially since we didn't have an opportunity to reshoot the podcast because we had originally scheduled the podcast for Friday. She ended up being an hour late for it, and when she showed up, she was in a car on her phone and not prepared to do the interview. fine. We rescheduled for Sunday, and then this happened, and this was for a Monday airing. So I obviously regret this. I invited her back on after she walked off the podcast to do a proper closing. We could have edited out that she walked out at all and finished the conversation. She declined to do so. I made my apologies in private, as you can see in the DMs that she shared. I think unethically. I won't be sharing any of her DMs that would flesh out the conversation even further, and frankly, I think not quite be so flattering. But ultimately, at the end of the day, she declined any of my offers and took to the internet the next day instead to smear me as a Nazi sympathizer. So it's not ideal. I hope that she will come back on the show and talk things out, because I would prefer not to have this kind of adversarial relationship with anybody. And I want our guests to always know that they're going to be treated fairly and graciously, but you can't win them all.
It's really interesting because, this really does highlight this conversation you had. It highlights this cancel culture sort of on the left where, if you're not in line, then you just get demonized. You yourself are part of the other team. You're far right. You're on the right. You're a right winger because you don't completely align with me ideologically. And it's interesting because I don't know if this sort of thing happens on the right. Maybe Robbie could actually kind of clue us into this a little bit more, but I don't know. Is there this sort of cancel culture where it's like, you're not right wing enough for us, or you're not supportive of whoever or whatever
Say anything untoward about President Trump. You could defend every policy and everything he's ever done, but if you deny that he is the literal reincarnation of our Savior, you can face that. So no, there's this is a sad reality of the tribal time we live in, that there's an unhealthy dialogue on both sides of the political spectrum, both far sides, and then of course in the middle, a middle that is often ignoring some of the more valid points that arise on both the sides. Thank you so much for being with us, Briahna. We really appreciate you talking about this. And again, just to be very clear, we would love to have Talia come here too and talk. We're not, this is an important conversation to have, and she should absolutely be able to share her perspective as well. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Coming up, the New York Times published a guest essay by a commander in the former Afghan National Guard named Sami Sadat, whose credibility is now being questioned, to say the least. Next on Rising. Stick with us. You won't want to miss this one.